Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks everybody who is tuning in on our various social media platforms. There we go. Alva Smith has joined us. Alva, if you don't mind, just make sure you mute yourself because we don't have behind the scene controls that can do that. So this is a public meeting we're having online, organised by People Before Profit during Pride Month about the struggle to end the oppression of LGBTQ plus people. It's a meeting, obviously, in the context in the last number of years of very important victories, like the victory on marriage equality, but also clearly where discrimination, oppression continues to exist in our society, and we're going to hear about that from our various speakers. The plan for the meeting is that we've 4 different speakers who will be presenting, speaking for 10 minutes each or so. Then we'd ask people definitely to put questions, comments into the channel, whatever social media platform you're watching this on. You can direct your questions towards a particular speaker or to all of the panel, and then probably at the end, we'll see how we're going in terms of time and in terms of questions. Probably at the end, we'll go back to each of the speakers to sum up and to answer some of the questions that are directed towards them or that they think they have an interest in. So we do have a fantastic range of speakers this evening. I'll introduce them all now, and then one by one as we come to them. So the first one we're going to be hearing from is Darragh Adelaide, who is a representative for People Before Profit in Clondalkin. Then, if Alva Smith has settled, and I think she has, thank you very much, Alva, we'll be hearing from Alva, who is a very experienced, very prominent feminist and LGBTQ plus activist. Then we'll be hearing from Owen Fagan, who is from the Anti-Conversion Therapy Coalition, and we're very thankful to have a speaker from that coalition with us this evening. Thanks, Owen. And then finally, we're going to Owen Darragh, who is a traveller and an LGBTQ plus rights activist and author. So, without further ado, we're getting various messages already thanking us for having the meeting and welcoming us and so on. We will start with Darragh. So off you go, Darragh, whenever you're ready.
Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a good Pride Month. My name is Darragh and I'm a People Before Profit rep for the Clondalkin area, and I want to start off by saying thanks for tuning in. I guess there is a lot to talk about today, but I want to start off by talking about maybe a misconception that people have when it comes to the fight for LGBTQ plus rights in Ireland. There's this kind of idea that once equal marriage, once the referendum passed, that that was the be all and end all of the fight for LGBTQ plus rights, that there was nothing to be really won after that. And I think it's a false perception. Equal marriage was a massive step forward, 100%. I mean, in a country where as recently as 1983, the Supreme Court ruled that the criminalization of homosexuality would remain legal because of the Christian nature of the Irish state. So we have come a long way since then. And it's thanks to regular people challenging the system, challenging the political establishment, that we've gotten those victories. But it's not true to say that the LGBT community that we've done fighting, that there's nothing left to fight for. I think, thinking back to the Supreme Court upholding homophobic laws on the basis of Ireland being a Christian state, it really seems like something of the past. But I don't think the problem of religious intervention in the rights of the LGBT community is something in the past, when 90% of our schools are run or owned by the Catholic Church. An education about sexuality and gender should under no circumstances be controlled by religious orders who themselves sometimes espouse homophobic rhetoric. People have a right to unbiased sex education. And unfortunately, when Solidarity People Before Profit put forward a bill on having unbiased sex education before the Dáil, and it passed, but it was blocked by Leo Varadkar using a quirk of the Constitution. So, I mean, this, having the church so involved in the education system, it's an outright failure of the state, not just in the provision of accurate and full education, but also in the prevention of, or what should be the prevention of, religious orders injecting things like homophobia into our schools and promoting archaic sex education. I mean, the title of this meeting is From Marriage Equality, the Road to the LGBTQ plus Liberation. And I guess trying to work out what liberation looks like is difficult. but an end to religious indoctrination in our schools and the separation of church and state is without a doubt a necessary step in that process, no matter what your opinions are, or I guess how you see the end goal of liberation, what it looks like. The Catholic Church hasn't just played a shameful role in the repression of LGBT people, but also in the lives of women and children in the laundries and the mother and baby homes. And unfortunately, what we've seen again and again is the Irish state, often with the likes of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael at the helm, has covered up those abuses, have made excuses for those abuses, and made a mockery of victims by granting the church indemnity. So as long as these religious orders play such a major role in our education system, and as long as there are politicians, I guess, that are ready to indemnify their actions, the fight has to continue well beyond just equal marriage. The fight continues on past that. And apart from just education, I think we need to properly scrutinize our health system. People Before Profit has, time and time again for years highlighted the failures within the system, how badly nurses are paid, the endless waiting lists, the lack of consultants, the two-tier system essentially, which you get treatment if you're able to afford private healthcare. If you don't, you're put on a waiting list. But I think it is immensely important that we also specifically highlight how the system fails LGBT people. Trans people in particular are often forced to go abroad for procedures because of how ill-equipped our health system is to provide for their needs. And the long waiting lists and the lack of mental health services is criminal. And it's a direct result of years of austerity and years of cutbacks and privatization. And another step on that road towards liberation that we're talking about is an All-Ireland National Health Service that, yes, it pays its workers fairly, and yes, it ends the waiting lists, but also that it doesn't leave gay and trans people behind in the provision of healthcare. Trans healthcare has to be included in that, with an end to the waiting lists and the enormous fees, and also putting in place a more humane process that doesn't include needlessly invasive questions and interviews. So I think beyond that, also we need a fight to restore funding for mental health services, and not just restore it, but to the pre-austerity levels, but also to increase them beyond that. LGBT people, especially young adults, are disproportionately affected by the cuts to these services because bullying and discrimination has a negative effect on our mental health. And again, this rhetoric that says, sure, you have equal marriage, what else is there to fight for? It doesn't recognize that it was one step in a long process of creating a fairer society. It was a necessary step, but it's by no means the last step. I also think, without a doubt, any movement or any political project with LGBT rights in mind, it can't ignore direct provision. I mean, all across the world, there's people fighting against brutal homophobic regimes, many of which are being upheld by the West. But when they come here, fleeing from violence, freeing from homophobia, we treat them as if they're less than human. They spend years in facilities outside of our communities where we can't see them, fighting just to be able to work or to be able to have an education. And in most cases, or in many cases, after spending years in Ireland, becoming part of or trying to become a part of our communities, they're deported back to their home countries where they will continue to be persecuted. In one particularly sickening case, the Department of Justice decided that they didn't believe a gay man was gay, that he didn't offer enough proof to them, as if we should be investigating these people and interrogating them rather than offering them support. In another case, Silva Takula, a transgender woman who died in direct provision, was buried in secret. None of her family or friends was informed about her death, and she was buried alone. So we can't say that Ireland is a safe place for LGBT people or an equal place while we're treating migrants and refugees like this. We need to stand with these people, yes, against persecution that they face in their own countries, but also at the hands of our own government. And thinking about other countries, the current Hungarian administration, who up until very recently shared the same European party as Leo Varadkar, that Hungarian government has made extremely and outwardly homophobic laws for the purpose of prosecuting LGBT people, and as well as silencing activists. Our movement towards liberation here in Ireland needs to be anti-racist in nature, but it also needs to be internationalist. We need to call on the EU or call the EU out for refusing to take action against homophobic tyrants. We need to stand with gay people in Europe and beyond, of course, whether they're seeking asylum here or whether they're still fighting in their own countries. So I guess maybe in contrast with the idea that, everything was done and finished after equal marriage, it was actually maybe the first step. I think there's a lot that we can still fight for. All the things I've talked about before, but also easier access to antiretroviral drugs, funding for community groups, the legal recognition of non-binary people on official documents, access to gender-neutral bathrooms in workplaces and schools. So I guess I'll end on this, that Pride is actually, I mean, of course, it's a celebration of everything we're about, but it's also a rebellion against social norms that tell us who we are and what we can do and what we can be, but also a rebellion for access to healthcare and for an end to austerity, for the separation of church and state, and for a fight against racism on behalf of the members of our community who are suffering in direct provision. And also, it's a fight against the political establishment, those in power who've watched over these injustices year after year. We're not looking for rainbow capitalism, where just the only difference is all the corporations put on rainbow flags when it's Pride. But what we're looking for is fundamental change. Yeah, we want inclusivity, but above all else, what we want is systemic change to our society. Like, I've talked about a couple of things. I'm sure other speakers after me will lay out pretty clearly what they think should change based on their own perspectives. But the very last point I'll make is that the way in which we fight for these things is also important to think about. Most of the stuff I've outlined today about healthcare and housing, that's people before profit policy, but it really isn't a question of having the best policy positions. It's about building a mass movement of regular people standing up against the system and demanding something better and something fairer and something more democratic. Everything I mentioned, like when it comes to an education system that isn't run by the Catholic Church, or free access to healthcare for all those who need it, those are tangible goals that all of us who are looking for LGBT liberation should be fighting for. But what we need to win those goals is a mass movement on the streets and in the Dáil and in our county councils and in our unions and workplaces. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that LGBTQ plus issues, they don't exist in isolation. The fight for education and healthcare and against racism are linked to other people, and we're all linked together through these struggles. So what we need is a united movement of people from all backgrounds and identities who are going to really fight for each other against this sort of oppression. So I guess then my final point is the need for solidarity, that we need to fight this together. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Darragh. I think that's a really great overview to start with in terms of the kind of struggles we need to have, how they're interlinked and all of that. So thanks a lot, Darragh. I'd ask people to continue to put in questions, comments into the chat. I see them coming here, one from PBP Tyrone. So next I will move on to Alva Smith, who, as I mentioned, is definitely a very prominent feminist and LGBTQ plus activist. Obviously played a leading role both in the struggle for marriage equality, but also abortion rights. So over to you, Alva.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks everybody for being here, and to People Before Profit for asking me. Really pleased to be here. I think there are a number of points in what I may be saying that definitely coincide with Darragh said the same. I mean, the sort of the very common touch points, but which you obviously have put in your own very inimitable way, Darragh. But I did want, I think, just to kind of give a sense of my overview of where a certain number of things are at the moment. And I think the first point the point I wanted to start off with is to say that, you know, I'm just looking at the screen here in front of me and I'm thinking generations divide us, whatever about anything else, so that I come from a generationally different world. And I think that's a very important point to make, because from my vantage point, which is very different from that of the two Owens and Darragh and also Paul, actually, you know, it's as if when I think back to when I came out way back when, it was a completely different world. It was just so different. Just to give you one example, I remember when I did come out saying to a friend who's lesbian like myself, oh, well, it's going to be very difficult coming out. And she said, don't worry about that. The only people you ever really can come out to at the moment are other lesbians, because nobody else wanted to know. So you would actually try and tell people that you're lesbian. And I really did in all the kinds of things I was doing as a lecturer, as, you know, somebody who might be on the radio or stuff like that. And you would say, I'm, you know, a lesbian and an academic and whatnot. And they'd say she's an academic, full stop. And they would just automatically, nobody wanted to say the word. So that's just one tiny example from my life and experience. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that there is some kind of path to liberation, and I think we are on it. Where the end point is, I don't think we're near that end point yet, but we're definitely on that path, because there have been massive shifts in law, in policy, in culture, in attitudes, and Darragh has spoken about those. Obviously, the trans recognition legislation in 2015 was, I think, very important, and is still, I think, one of the better laws, if not the best law in Europe on trans rights, which is not to say that the delivery of services that should flow from and rights that should flow from that law are okay, because they're absolutely not. And I'll probably come back to that. And at the same time, in 2015, we had marriage equality. And I think that they were both big leaps forward for Ireland and people in this country in terms of their attitudes towards LGBTIQ people. But they were just that, stepping stones. They were, and should never ever be seen as ends in, that were a kind of an end to some sort of struggle. I do worry sometimes that even within our very diverse LGBTIQ community, that, people may feel that they get married, they settle down, they have kids, and kind of that's it. And that was always one of my fears during the lead up to that marriage equality referendum, that there is a tendency, and my apologies to anybody in the audience here who's married, but there is a tendency to kind of settle down. And frankly, in order to achieve that liberation, we have to have revolution. And revolution on the whole requires you to be a somewhat less settled person, at least in your attitudes and your approaches and what you're prepared to do in life. So one of the things I do feel that we need more of in the LGBTIQ community at the moment, it's also true probably across a bit of the board elsewhere, is more revolutionaries. But that can be discussed later if you want to. But nonetheless, those things have contributed to the different world that we all actually inhabit now. But it is still such an incredibly slow process. And I think what it's really the point that I think is really important, that progress is slow, but it is much slower, and it is very uneven, and it is much slower for some, for many, than for others. And I think that points to something that really wasn't visible. It was there maybe, but not visible to us when I came out, 30, 40 years ago. That is that the variety and the complexity and the diversity of our LGBTIQ community now, making it, in fact, in some ways, much more difficult to talk about a community. And very often I find myself talking about our LGBTIQ communities. I believe in that idea, absolutely, that Darragh ended with, of solidarity. But I think we have to recognize, obviously, and those of us who've been around a long time, maybe more than anybody, that is really very difficult to achieve when there are such profound inequalities between people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, trans, and non-binary. So I think that is that growth and that sense also of a spectrum of sexuality. That's really quite new. And I'm not sure that as a community, or even a set of communities, that we are dealing with that very well. Other people may have other ideas. Just a word about that spectrum. People do say to me sometimes, have you always been a lesbian? And I say, well, I don't think so, because, I did have relationships with men before I was a lesbian. That sort of felt okay. And then I became lesbian. So I'm not like somebody who at the age of 5 or 6 or 7 knew I was lesbian. I really didn't. And I wasn't even a tomboy. So, it's kind of weird, I suppose, in some ways, maybe. But what I do think very strongly is that had I realized when I was in my teens and in my 20s that sexuality wasn't a kind of one thing, just one thing or one other thing. I might very well have been something quite different from what I am now today. I'm very proud to be a lesbian. I'm very happy being a lesbian, but that's not to say that other opportunities might not also have been very attractive and also descriptors. I might well have liked to call myself non-binary, for example, and that's not. I'm not prevented from doing that now, but nonetheless, I do think that that sense of a spectrum has really shifted our own attitudes within LGBTI communities enormously, and I have to say that it's one of the things that I really love and value most about changes that have happened. But there are so many problems for people. Darragh, you've touched on them. I'm just going to run through a couple of my own, but I think they're in some ways very similar. Just because we have marriage equality, just because there is a trans recognition law, that doesn't mean that homophobia and transphobia, even more so, have gone. In fact, transphobia is more acute now than it was 3 or 4 years ago, as far as I can see. And that has to do with other political forces, of course. But I do think that everybody pretty well who is lesbian or gay or bisexual or non-binary or intersex or trans really encounters it one way or another. We can set up different kinds of protections, those of us who have certain privileges and very definite privileges, but they that is still there in our society. And I think that's one of the things that we have to keep working to try to, in a way, integrate or embed that not just acceptance, but just understanding of sexuality as a spectrum, and that you're neither good or bad or more or less or anything if you are on one part of that spectrum at a particular moment in your time, in your life. And getting that thought through, I think, is a huge problem. I would say that I think one of the big problems for the community and for social policy in this country and health policy is actually understanding that the needs of many groups within that community are not being met in health terms or in terms of social provision. That is particularly and very obviously true for people who are trans or intersex or non-binary. And absolutely agree, Darragh, that those are areas of the spectrum that need to be named and recognised in our social provision and in our health policy. The healthcare failures to provide in a very obvious way for people who are trans are really quite disgraceful at this stage, because there has been plenty of time to get there, and they're just not doing it. And that is why I completely agree that the separation of church and state and not allowing the National Maternity Hospital to be built on land owned by the Catholic Church is these are still absolutely urgent issues for us. I think, too, to pick up on Darragh's point, that there are very severe difficulties for LGBTIQ refugees and asylum seekers living in, I was going to say they're living in completely unsuitable accommodation. Let's face it, the accommodation that all people in direct provision are living in is completely unsuitable and inadequate and disgraceful. But there is another layer of intense difficulty and danger for people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or intersex or trans. And I think that it is absolutely urgent that these problems be sorted. They can't wait 2023 when Roderick O'Gorman, the minister, says everything is going to be resolved. This needs to happen now, because, as Darragh pointed out, there has been one fatality and there could indeed be more, and certainly serious mental health problems as well as physical problems for people. So that, I think, is of great concern to us. Let's remember, too, that bullying, intimidation in schools of all LGBTIQ people is still absolutely rampant. Spends a lot of time and its huge resources in trying to actually deal with it. And it is there for students, but actually it's also there for teachers. There are teachers in many Catholic schools who are really would find it very difficult to come out, and particularly to come out as trans or intersex. I don't think I'm not even sure that that's even been thought of. And maybe just to just two more points on the problems that, overt discrimination is illegal in the workplace and has been for a very long time. But please do not tell me that LGBTIQ people are not discriminated against in the workplace. They are, we are. And that is particularly true at the moment in relation to trans people. And extra safeguards, I think, need to be put in. And I would put it up to the trade unions, actually, to be much more to the forefront in that particular struggle. I think they have been weak, and I think that they need to push far harder to protect and to achieve further rights for people in our community who are in the workforce. And the last point on this list of problems is one that Darragh has dealt with. When I say things are uneven, it really because it has taken a while, it has taken a long time to recognise intersexuality in relation to sexuality, where it was recognised with regard to gender, but not in regard to race and ethnicity, not in regard to a disability, not in regard, I think, either to social class. And also one that you may smile, you may laugh, but it's actually quite close to my heart. Older LGBTIQs are not getting much of a look in. Understandably, we're concerned about what happens to young people. But actually, older LGBTIQs have often had incredibly hard lives and have paid a very high price for who and what they are. All of the surveys show that they're much more likely to live alone. They're much more likely not to have kids. And we live in a state which basically says, oh, your children during COVID, don't worry, your children will look after you. Your families will look after you. But what if you don't have one of those families? You're estranged from your family of birth, maybe. You haven't been able to, or haven't wanted to set up a family of your own. And there is nobody out there in the health services that is really up for you. And I think that is, it just breaks my heart when I see that coming. And this has been, by the way, particularly noticeable during COVID. And I want to say that the impacts of COVID on our LGBTIQ community right across the board, I see Owen de Bardoon nodding his head there. I mean, I'm very well aware in traveller communities that this is also extremely complex and really, really, really bad. And we haven't, when I say we, the state has not even begun to deal with that in terms of health services. And we have to look at it. I think I'm running out of time. I would think Paul must be raising his hand now. But you did ask me, or somebody asked me, to talk about threats. And I think everything I've been saying is, in a way, the ordinary everyday grind of discrimination and stigmatization and exclusion and marginalization for so many people outside urban areas in particular, and for particular groups within our community that I've been mentioning, that's still very strong. A big threat is still the Catholic Church. It still wants to control. It wants to control sex education. It wants to control healthcare, not just because of some kind of Catholic theology, but because it's also big money and power. We have similarly the extreme right backlash, and there's always the risk and the fear of the extreme damage that can be done on what is vulnerable and fragile ground, and the damage that can be done to particularly fragile and vulnerable people. And we've seen that with the conversion therapy movement, for example. And that's why, I'm really very pleased that we now have the strong group, which Paul is part of as well, LCALA, Diversity Not Division, and that we really are very aware of the ways in which trans people and lesbians and gays and intersex and non-binary are being targeted, as well as people who are migrant, people who are people of colour. And let me say that people with disabilities, they're not anybody's targets, really, are they? That's something we really have to think about, that we do not look towards and think about what people with disabilities in our own community may need. Never mind, I mean, the state's not going to do it, not very easily. And I think that we need to be doing it. On the plus side, I will say that we have incredibly strong, hardworking organisations all over the place. And we still have GCN, which is becoming more radical by the year. And that I absolutely value and cherish. I was also asked to say what we should do. Well, keep on going, we should keep on fighting, and we have to build it and integrate everything and embed that in our movements. these issues are not just issues, as a friend of mine says regularly, that's not just for the gays, this should be for everybody. And I think that's so true. We're so used to kind of dealing with these things ourselves as a community, but it's not just our responsibility. If this country believes in equality, everybody needs to be out there fighting for us as they fight for themselves as cis straight people. And I feel that incredibly strongly, and I think People Before Profit can make a huge contribution in that domain by simply integrating, as a matter of just ordinary everyday politicking, the issues and the struggles and the campaigns for the rights, the equality, the well-being, the health, the happiness of people in my community that I remain extremely proud of. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a million, Ava. That was very thought-provoking, I think. Someone put a good comment saying, thanks for a hugely personal and insightful, oh, it's gone off my screen, insightful something, a contribution, Ava, and also bringing us up to just, a couple of days ago, in terms of the very successful demonstration to keep the National Maternity Hospital in proper full public ownership and public control, which is a crucial struggle right now, and we'll see what happens this week on that. So thanks a million, Alba. Next, we have Owen Fagan, who is from the Anti-Conversion Therapy Coalition. People might have seen the work of that coalition on social media in particular, in terms of highlighting the campaign to get conversion therapy, so-called, banned. So Owen will bring us up to speed about the horrors of conversion therapy and the struggle against it.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for joining in today and for inviting me. And I don't know how I'm going to follow those two wonderful speeches from both Alva and Darragh, but I will give it a go. I might preface this with a little content or trigger warning for conversion therapy for everyone in the audience. Let me first start by defining what conversion therapy is. Conversion therapy refers to any form of treatment proposed to change a person's sexual orientation or to suppress a person's gender identity. These therapies are both unethical, harmful, and based on a belief that being gay or transgender is a mental illness and can be cured. Back in 2012, the Pan American Health Organization noted that conversion therapies not only had no medical justification, but also represented a severe threat to the health and human rights of the affected persons. And back in 2016, the World Psychiatric Association reportedly found that there was no sound scientific evidence that innate sexual orientation can be changed. And then in 2020, the independent forensic expert group of health specialists declared that conversion therapy is a form of deception and false advertising and fraud. Yet conversion therapy continues to be practiced in a multitude of countries across all regions of the world. In fact, in a UN report in May of 2020, an independent expert said that the word therapy, which is derived from Greek, is supposed to denote healing. However, practices of conversion therapy are just the opposite. They inflict severe pain and suffering, resulting in long-lasting psychological and physical damage. At its core, conversion therapy is a cruel and abhorrent practice that serves only to destroy and erase the LGBTQIA+ community. The UN envoy cites a recent global study that suggests 4 out of 5 persons who are subjected to this horrible practice were younger than 25 at the time. And of those, roughly half were under the age of 18. So roughly half of the people under the age of 25 subjected to conversion therapy worldwide are minors. While there is a misconception that conversion therapy only happens within dedicated centres, and don't get me wrong, it does happen in dedicated centres, but this misconception that it is limited solely to dedicated centres could not be farther from the truth. Conversion therapy can be provided by priests, ministers, counsellors, and many other local groups, and a lot of this flies under the radar and often goes unnoticed by the rest of the community. These practices are also prevalent in the healthcare sector, in particular with the trans community when seeking trans-specific healthcare. In fact, there have been many reports of people being dehumanized going through trans clinics, in particular in Loughlinstown. As it stands, only Brazil, Ecuador, Malta, and Germany have nationwide bans on the practice of conversion therapy. And then only regional laws exist in parts of the United States of America, Spain, Canada, and Australia. In Ireland at the moment, legislation is currently before the Oireachtas to ban conversion therapy in Ireland and is only in the third stage, the committee stage, in the Seanad. It is an aim of the Anti-Conversion Therapy Coalition to support this legislation called the Prohibition of Conversion Therapies Bill 2018, sponsored by Senator Fintan Warfield. This legislation seeks to prohibit conversion therapy as a deceptive and harmful act or practice against a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression. This piece of legislation has received cross-party support and praise. And in our campaign, we wanted to carry on that spirit with the formation of our campaign. We firmly believe that LGBTQIA+ rights are human rights. And therefore, this is an issue that transcends political ties. This is a human rights issue. And we firmly believe that there should be no bickering between party lines over this and that, because that is allowing it to get bogged down in bureaucracy and politics, which I cannot stress this enough. The subjection of people to conversion therapy it transcends that issue completely. It is above politics. It is human rights. On Tuesday, the 15th of June this year, members of our campaign met with the Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, Minister Roderick O'Gorman, to discuss our campaign and the state of play regarding a ban of conversion therapy in the Republic of Ireland. Minister O'Gorman in this meeting affirmed his support for our campaign, and it was welcoming to see his commitment to put a meaningful and comprehensive legislation in place to protect the LGBTQIA+ community from this harmful and traumatizing practice. Minister O'Gorman affirmed his support and expressed an eagerness to work with Senator Fintan Warfield, who brought forward this Prohibition of Conversion Therapies Bill in 2018 before the Seanad. And although some legal concerns regarding how any legislation could be worded were raised, he remained optimistic that these issues could be ironed out with further research into how this practice takes place in Ireland. We were informed during this meeting that a subgroup under the LGBTI inclusion strategy dedicated to the gathering of necessary information on conversion therapy has been formed and will undertake a national survey in the coming months to better understand the prevalence of the practice in the Republic of Ireland. In Northern Ireland, as our campaign is a cross-border campaign that aims to ban conversion therapy on the entire island of Ireland. In Northern Ireland, a motion was put before the Northern Ireland Assembly by the Ulster Unionist Party by MLA Doug Beattie and John Stewart. This is not a legally binding motion. However, this motion argued that it is fundamentally wrong to view the LGBTQ community as needing a fix or a cure, which is a sentiment that we stand by and fully agree. This motion, despite the efforts of the DUP proposing an amendment to this bill to include religious protections, passed overwhelmingly in its original form by 59 votes to 24. In fact, the concerns or so-called concerns raised by the DUP on religious freedoms are nothing more than a smokescreen to hide their homophobia. In fact, in March of 2020, a UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religious Belief, Ahmed Shahid, said, and I quote, "I firmly reject any claim that religious beliefs can be invoked as a legitimate justification for violence or discrimination against women, girls, or the LGBT community." He also noted that the right to religious freedom protects individuals and not religions as such. In his report, the UN expert It urges states across the world to repeal gender-based discrimination laws, including those enacted with reference to religious considerations that criminalize adultery, criminalize persons on the basis of their actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity, to criminalize abortion in all cases. So just to clarify that, he wants that to be repealed, and to facilitate all religious practice that violate human rights. Though that list there is what the UN urges states across the world for what those laws should be repealed. He further goes on to say that women and LGBT plus people experience discrimination and violence inflicted in the name of religion by state and non-state actors that impedes their ability to fully enjoy their human rights, including their right to freedom of religion or belief. He is an independent expert who also expressed deep concern at the rise in political campaigns and those carried out by religious institutions and their followers, which invoke religious freedom to seek roll back human rights that are, as he said, fundamental to gender equality at both national and international levels. This motion, having passed in Northern Ireland, now means that the Communities Minister, Darragh, has now come and said that her officials have started to work to inform the drafting of legislation to ban conversion therapy in Northern Ireland. I think it's entirely important, and as a campaign, we think it's entirely important that just because we don't hear about this issue often, because it is such a deceptive practice, it does not mean that it is not insignificant. This practice is still happening to many LGBT plus people across Ireland and the UK, and we can no longer sit back and allow this torture of the LGBT plus community to continue. I implore people that if they feel they want to get involved to help, to follow our socials on our campaign at Anti-CT Coalition online. It is vital that, you know, the people get involved in these campaigns, to contact their local representatives and their national representatives, to encourage them to support any legislation that comes up surrounding conversion therapy and ending it in all its forms. It is crucial that people both in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland get onto their elected officials to support these bans, because we cannot have a situation where there are legal loopholes that exist on either side of the border that allow people to be subjected to further torture on this island. We ask that everyone supports us to make sure that any legislation that comes up does not have exemptions for religious organizations. And we also ask that on a fundamental level that you support your LGBTQIA plus friends. Coming out can be a really daunting experience for many people in this community, and support and acceptance will help people in the LGBTQIA plus community feel comfortable in their sexuality and in their gender, and it gives them a healthy support network to rely on, rather than being turned towards practices such as conversion therapy or any other harmful practices in the false belief that it can fix them or that there's anything wrong with them. Thank you so much for having me on tonight, and I'll leave that one there. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Owen. Fair play, and thanks to everybody involved in campaigning. And definitely you have our full support and endorsement, 100%. And I think it like precisely underlines the point about liberation not being achieved whenever, I mean, those horrifying figures in terms of both internationally and on this island. So yeah, definitely encourage everyone to get involved in the campaign, pressurize their public representatives, and try and push it on with the bill. So last, but far from least, we have Owen Darragh, who is a traveller activist and an LGBTQ plus rights activist, and also an author. Before we go to Owen, just encourage people, if you've got any questions, fire them in now, because then we're going to quickly fly back to all the panelists at the end, exactly as it says there. Please feel free to place comments and questions in the comment section. And there are there's interesting discussion happening in the comment section already. So even if it's not a question, people panelists might comment in the end, or other people who are watching may be educated and enlightened by your comment. So we try to facilitate a discussion here, even if it's not quite as good as being in person. So off you go, Owen, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for which I want to say is actually genuinely insightful input from everyone here today. When I go to spaces like this, I know it's the thoughts, ideas, but like I always kind of leave at times feeling that I'm living in a very divided world. Some of the issues that people are identifying and speaking of are so much more confounded and compounded at times because you're a traveller, and those struggles are not always identifying being the same struggle. Like the traveller movement is an LGBTQI movement because there are LGBTQI people within that. The LGBTQI movement is a traveller movement because they are travellers within that movement. And I think that sometimes the sharp blade of policy wants us to be divided. And I almost said kind of you choose between your traveller sense and your LGBT sense, and very rarely do they come together. Because even moments ago we were talking about conversion therapy and the dangers and the hatred and the anger and the pain that can cause. And I've lived in a society that has been converted me into a settled person my entire life, via policies and structures in schools, and even at the risk of having basic access. And I think that when we are looking at those things, that we need to step back and realize that it's not just on one topic; it's on multiple grounds, and that reason to that sense of people wanting to conform to an ideal notion is damaging to everybody. And we need to start being more inclusive around the idea of how is it affecting other people and what their journeys towards that is. And because even think of things like the big moment in my life that comes up about I suppose the LGBT kind of movement, I think a decriminalization in '93. Since 2001, nomadism to a traveller is illegal in this country. So a part of my identity and my right to express my identity is illegal. And how that is not seen to be a threat to other LGBT people is astounding to me. Because if they can treat travellers in this way, trust me, we're not that far away from those provisions. I think the Equal Status Act, wonderful. Travellers are the last, were the last on the list because we had to fight to get on that list. And those provisions are incredibly weak. Even a couple of like it started about 2 years ago, where judges started throwing out cases because they decided the person either sounded or looks like a traveller. So we have settled people in structure deciding you're not traveller enough to be protected. And marriage equality, the legal right for travellers have been there for a very long time and been established, but our ability to engage with those rituals socially is like almost non-existent. You know, COVID for many people in my family and my reach was not expected in the same ways because we weren't going out socially. I mean, like, even our language, we don't say we went out, we say we got in. People weren't allowed to have weddings in hotels, and how that is so very well known by so many people and is not seen to be a risk. It just shows you how close we are for us all stepping backwards in time rather than forward. When it comes to employment, I mean, some provisions there are inability to be, I suppose, the social mitigation and migration, because anyone can be LGBT, but a traveller can only be a traveller, because we're born within the community. 86% of our people are unemployed. So if you're coming out and you're changing your life, where do you go when people won't accommodate us? Like in average, travellers are 20 times more likely to be with a homeless, and that's not just culturally appropriate because people think it's all about homeless. That's in general. Like 20% more likely to be homeless. Unemployment rate so high. Education factors. I mean, we're not even named in the curriculum, and we've always been a part of Irish history and culture. In fact, on Thursday there's a bill, the Travel History and Culture Bill, is coming up, and if anyone could be support, I think they should support it, because what it's asking for is that Ireland to have a more reflective and honest understanding of its own history. So Ireland has not recognised all of its children, but it has an opportunity to recognise more of them. And when we're looking at even policies, even like modern policies, we have the NITRIS, which is the National Travel Roma Inclusion Strategy, that names LGBT travellers, and it redirects the resources and energy to the LGBTQI youth strategy. And the LGBTQI youth strategy recognises LGBT travellers and makes reference to the NITRIS, the National Travel Roma Strategy, and both are referring to each other without resources or energy or their bridging. So these are things I think that we can change in the moment, but I think we need to be very honest and upfront that the discrimination is so inherent within the fabric of Irish culture and society that we need to challenge that. For instance, like when I came out of 20 odd years ago, I had more of a shock to coming out to the LGBT community than the traveller community. Because I am a traveller, I've always been a traveller, and my identity as a queer man will not dissolve even being a traveller. I am who I am, and my community recognises my ethnicity. When I came out into LGBT spaces, There is almost a distinct need for you to dissolve your traveller identity. And what happened to me was that the traveller community never told me they would love me. They never told me they would embrace me. They never told me they would celebrate all my diversity. The LGBT community did, and has at times continued to fail on that, because we do not at times seem to have the capacity within us to recognize how deeply infixed the anti-traveller rhetoric is within people. You know, and it's also having those uncomfortable conversations and having those uncomfortable spaces, but at least doing it honestly, because they effectively, like 1 in 11 travellers in general pass by suicide. Like, I mean, when you compound that by additional issues around isolation, division, because even those things that come up earlier around, like our elders, our older care, our life expectancy is 61. Like people in my community don't even talk about pensions. You know, and I think that we need to go back to core and say policies is important and movements are important, and embrace people as direct provision, because I think there's such an alliance there for how the state can get away with how it treats people, and that is a warning to us that this is what the state can do when you're not favoured, when the tides shift and the rivers flow in a different direction, because it can happen. And so, and I think that the more we allow those things to happen, the more we are actually at risk. And I think we need to have the honesty to say, like, we have failed and we've all failed. And even when it comes to like LGBT movements and I suppose people being critical of the trans community, it almost always come about our culture, how we have a culture of rejecting LGBT people. And rather than Irish society has had a culture of rejecting LGBT people. We're the same. We're the same. And however, that rhetoric very quickly turns into anti-traveller. Like, how hard was it coming out? How badly were you treated by other travellers? And you kind of go, I don't know a single such person had a great time coming out. I don't know anyone had a great time being accepted by everyone around them. But the narrative tweaks because there's an underlying bias that's anti-traveller that people at times aren't able or ready to really embrace with. And yeah, I mean, like there's so much more that we can do, but we need to be very conscious and realistic of who we're doing it with and how we are doing it. Because if we do leave people behind, trust me, we're not moving forward. We're leaving the tracks back to how it stays very strongly. If you're not in favour, you are endangered. And while we have made some progressions, and those progressions have been so hard won, they have been so fought for over such a significant amount of time, I am not so convinced they cannot sit backwards. So I'm someone whose identity is illegal. I cannot travel. My family do not have access to social spaces. 2 weeks ago, or last week, there was a genuine and authentic uproar of someone burning a flag, a pride flag, and I thought that was very justified. We have stopped talking about people burning Trevor homes. Like last year alone, there was 3 Trevor homes across the country that were burnt, and people moved on. People talk about Carrick Mines, the loss of life and the loss of connection and hope. They did not talk about how that surviving family had protesters stopping them from moving into a field across the road, and how they ended up in a car park space beside the dump. So I think that when we're talking about LGBT liberation, we need to know that we are not single individuals. We come with families, and connections, and identities, and ethnicities, and we are more than that. I think that when we have these spaces, and we're talking about like conversion, there's nuanced space. We're talking about particularly their LGBT, there's nuanced spaces. We're talking about employment and their identity. Like these things are so heavily nuanced that there are people within this country and across the world that feel so very far more removed from those spaces, and feel those spaces don't belong to them, even when they're claiming to be welcoming and warm. And even our healthcare, I mean, like the idea of cultural competency, and like even here, I'm living in South Dublin. I know of certain GPs in the area like, who are not traveller friendly, and they may be LGBT friendly, you know, but are not traveller friendly. So to find someone who intersects those two identities is actually quite difficult in a very real way. And I think that when we're having these conversations, we need to make sure who's not at the table and how can we ensure that even if their voice may not be loud enough in the loudness of all the other struggles and risks, that we can actually dedicate ourselves authentically and really to forging and maintaining those relationships. Because if we don't, the risk is genuinely of loss of life and loss of harmony and loss of our own any sense of progression. Because no one is safe when people are being actively and proactively denied liberties, denied their identity, and having laws that are so very valuable eroded from them because they intersect in a different way. And I apologies for like steamrolling here, but I'm so very inspired by all the insight and the oversight and the sense of nuance and the policies that's come up this evening. I do think that as long as travellers are left in like 72 million being underspent for basic accommodation, as long as sites are filled with rats, as long as direct provision which I think we need a new name for, because the idea that sounds so warm and it's such a cruel. As long as these structures can exist, we are not far at all from any sort of great tragedy or exclusion, isolation, or country. And I think that at times we need to find warmth in our progressions, and we need to find celebration in them. But as it comes to liberation, to be honest, I feel as someone who's incredibly unliberated, and I'm speaking as someone who has incredible privilege within my community. And I think that when we're having these spaces, that we need to be aware and continue to push for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen, for a very powerful contribution, which I think really kind of rounded us off very well in terms of where we started from Darragh talking about the intersection of various oppressions and so on, and then finishing up with Owen. So really, thanks a million. In terms of what we're doing now, well, one thing I'd like to push, and perhaps our background people can facilitate me by putting in the petition link on change.org. There it is, which is a petition to end the blood ban on gay men, which continues to persist. So it's a very important issue. So if people can sign and share and everything else, that would be excellent. A range of different questions have come in as we've been going. We don't intend to kind of stay here all night, or certainly I don't intend to stay here all night, and I presume the panelists are the same. But we might take 15 minutes or so to go through a couple of different questions. So what I suggest to do is like a quick fire round. I will not select the contributors. I will pose a question, and then I invite the panelists to indicate if they're interested in commenting briefly on that. These are some of the questions that came up. One of the things that actually struck me in terms of what Owen was saying there, an important point, is that things can slip backwards. You know, sometimes there's like kind of a philosophy that things just move forward. Things only ever proceed, whereas actually, unfortunately, there's plenty of evidence in the development of human society of, you know, deep reactionary regressions and steps backward. And that links to a question that was posed in the chat about the rise or potential rise of the far right and the rise of homophobia. So I just wondered, does one of the panelists want to comment on that, about where do they think we were at in that? Because it is a kind of contradictory moment, because kind of winning some important legal rights, for example, marriage equality, but then on the other hand, at some level, you know, at some level you have, you know, them very prominent people like Trump or whatever, like spewing out very backward, very reactionary, homophobic ideas. You have, you know, anti-trans ideas less prevalent in certain circles here than in other countries, like in Britain, for example, but still also prevalent. So how do people see that kind of relationship now? Is there anyone who would like to comment briefly on that? Go for it, Alva.
Very briefly, first of all, I completely agree with that idea. I mean, it was something I remember somebody said to me a long time ago in the women's movement, oh, you're so optimistic about everything, but never make the mistake of thinking they can't take it away from you. And it's something that has really, really, really stayed with me. And it's one of the reasons why it's such a difficult thought contradiction in a way to hold in your head. I mean, progress isn't linear. We know that. Paul was saying that. We know that. But at the same time, you have to fight and you have to go ahead to try to make the gains, to try to win the rights, to try to change the system and the structures so that people can live decent lives with some chance to flourish as human beings, while at the same time being perfectly well aware that over the back of your shoulder, you have to always keep an eye on what's coming up behind you. And I do think this is a very dangerous time in the world at the moment. And I don't think that Ireland is at all, you know, exempt or immune to the depredations of the far right. And I think that we have to stand up very strongly against them. But that holding in your head that the recognition that you can slip backwards and that gains can be taken away. You have to work hard, but it's important not to let that prevent you from keeping on going, just going forwards, if I'm making any sense on that.
Thanks, Alva. A lot of sense, I think. Does anyone else want to comment on that, or will I move on to the next question? I'll move on to the next question. And so the next question I was going to go for is that the panelists have all spoken about how important intersectionality is between different communities, travelers, Black communities, etc. How do we reach across to all these groups to foster solidarity with the LGBTQ community? Does anyone want to take that one? So it has definitely been a theme of the evening. Go for it, Darragh.
I think it's a really great question. It's a difficult one to answer. Like, how do you actually connect all these struggles? Because, I mean, on some level, we all do look disconnected, and we do form our small communities, and those communities are important. And it is difficult to look at the bigger picture sometimes. But I think we do need to look at things in terms of, you know, it is systemic change that we're looking for. When I'm fighting for anti-racism, I'm not fighting for just, you know, the parts of the community that look and act like me, and other anti-racists aren't just fighting for themselves. They're fighting for LGBT people. They're fighting for travelers. I think trying to realize that us as individuals on our own, we're a lot weaker than we are than when we're working together. It is something difficult because there are these divides between us in terms of sexuality, in terms of race, in terms of sex even. But the way that we fight against that, one way I think is great, is by forming united fronts, things like Lakela and anti-racism networks that say, you know what, we're not buying what the far right is saying. We're not buying into their rhetoric. No matter what background people are from, we're here to fight against that. Beyond that as well, that realizing that it's the same system that's got us all down in some way. When I talk about racism, I talk about exploitation in Africa. I talk about all these corporations that are, I guess, strip mining Africa for the resources to create profit. That profit-driven system is also affecting other people that I'd say maybe it's the same fight for workers' rights as it is against racism. I think there are ways to link these struggles together materially, because at the end of the day, what we are looking for is structural change. We're looking for systemic change to the way our society function. And in every single one of these struggles, what we are fighting for at its core is creating a more democratic society, a fairer society that is based on the material needs of the regular person rather than any of these. I guess I'll sum it up quickly, is that each of us as individuals, you as maybe a gay person and a person maybe in Nigeria that you've never met before, you have more in common than you have in difference, if you understand what I mean. So all of us, whether whatever background you're from, I have more in common with a traveler than I do in difference. So from my own personal viewpoint, I'm willing to fight for anybody who's willing to fight for me. As long as we stand together, I think we can beat. I mean, sometimes it's easy to be pessimistic when we look at the rise of the far right, when we look at the rise of Trump, that sort of thing. Whenever we do make social progress, there's always a reaction against it. But I think if we're united in that struggle, which is very easy to say, but if we do show that solidarity, I'm hopeful that we can actually make change.
Thanks a million, Darragh. Okay, we'll move on to the next question, which came in the chat quite early on, and it was "We Are Family" was the banner leading the Pride March in 2018, and they posed the question: how can that be? How can we say we are family at a time when so many people are unable to come out to their families? I don't know if there's anyone interested in taking that one. Owen,
yeah.
Go over it on.
I actually I remember that, and I think that was and it remains a very profound message, because we are family, and not only the point of I suppose an aspiration of how we are connected, and reviewing that connection, and canoe that we are all trades are bound in the fabric of our lives and societies, but also as a point that some people interpreted that almost as rebellion, that we had the audacity of saying, like, oh no, actually, like, we belong to one another, like there's no removing us, like we're here, and we might as well like kind of grow in the warmth of embracing that connection, and also the truth and the need of actually a true a true solidarity. I think that when it comes to those kind of statements and those kind of requests and those kind of invitations to see people as they are in those connections, it comes down to things like resources, policies, people, like actually including people who are not being excluded. Like also state provisions is incredibly important. I mean, like when it comes to teaching and healthcare, and I think that's where those connections on a very authentic level can be made. Because I think one of the difficulties, especially with some minority groups, is that we don't mix and we don't mingle because you don't have the social access to one another, and it's very easy to dislike or have difficulty towards an idea. but it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult in a real sense that to actually have hatred towards a person that you know, who's more complex and diverse and beautiful with all the other parts of their identity that is just as equal. So I think that we are family is something that, rather than looking at the world to work on, is something that we all need to work on. We all have a responsibility. The state has a responsibility, the communities have a responsibility, the organizations have, but also ourselves. And that is a very difficult request, and it's something that we all are spending our lives in actualizing. But I do think that it does have the ability to manifest. But it's something that comes with the sense of it's a wider journey, not just one, again, that silver blade cuts out an aspect of ourselves saying, here, look at this part and embrace this part. Because we're more than that. We're like, we are the spectrum of all this wonderfulness. So I think that it's difficult, and I have so much. I try to do it in myself. I try to foster patience for people that get frustrated when people don't come out. And obviously, you need to risk yourself. You need to be, go that connections, rather than going. We need to really go to heart about the policies, about the resources, that don't actually undermine people's ability to hold on to themselves, but also like basic state provisions and our ability to connect as people, as real people, because we are family is so beautifully simple, but it's also an ongoing invitation.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Owen. That's extremely well explained and argued. Okay, we might just take one final question, which is to Owen Fagan, in terms of how can people help? People obviously heard what you were saying about like really the horrors of conversion therapy. And so what can people do to help if they want to get involved?
Yeah, I can answer that. That's no problem. So I suppose the crucial thing is to make sure that you're getting involved with your local LGBT plus campaign group, your local groups, as well as joining advocacy groups such as ours. You can follow our social media at Anti-CT Coalition on both Twitter and Instagram, as well. We're on Facebook too, and we are an all-island coalition for a more Northern Ireland specific campaign. At Ban Conversion Therapy NI, or for anyone who's joining us tonight from either Scotland or England, you can follow the socials of at ECT Scotland or at BanCT.org for both Scotland and I suppose the whole of the UK, respectively. We also have a petition on our social media which calls for a ban island-wide for conversion therapy, which is currently sitting at just short of 18,500 signatures. So that's the pinned tweet on our Twitter. And then as well as that, I suppose one of the biggest things that you can do is really keep up the pressure on elective representatives and elective officials, because while a lot of work has been done through our campaign, it's important to remember this piece of legislation has been sitting in the Seanad, sitting up until very recently at the second stage, only recently put to the third stage, the committee stage in the Seanad, since 2018. We're in 2021 now, and this legislation is still sitting in the committee stage in the Seanad, and up in Northern Ireland as well. Only recently a motion has been passed, and it's not legally binding. So it's important that you keep up pressure on the Minister for Communities, Darragh Darragh, and her office as well, and as well as the rest of the elective MLAs in Northern Ireland, to keep pushing for legislation to be passed both north and south of the border, and as well for anyone joining us from the United Kingdom, England, Wales, and Scotland, to keep up pressure on your MPs and your elected representatives to make sure that legislation that is comprehensive and thorough in a ban and legal and criminalization of conversion therapy is put through. I think that pretty much covers it in terms of how people can get involved and help our campaign, and indeed the campaign in the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland as well.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Owen, and thanks for all your campaigning work. So I think we're going to wrap it up there if people are happy to do so. First thing I want to do is say really thanks a million to all our extremely powerful, effective, impressive speakers. And I think that's reflected in all the different comments, people complimenting you on what you've said. So really, thanks a million for taking your time out this evening to come and talk to us. And the one good thing, there's many bad things about online meetings, but the one good thing is it means that it's recorded, it's there, more and more people will be able to watch it over the next while. Second thing I would say is encourage people who are watching, if they're considering, definitely get involved in People Before Profit, and definitely get involved in all the various campaigns and so on that have been mentioned here. But consider joining People Before Profit. There's the link down there, pbp.ie/join. Smash that join button. Then the last thing I want to do is just thanks a million to all the people behind the scenes. So this meeting partly flows from a newly set up caucus within People Before Profit, the LGBTQ plus caucus, and Ben has done a lot of work to help organize this meeting and is involved in the caucus. So thanks a million, Ben, and everyone who's involved in the caucus. Thanks a lot to Emma, who is behind the scenes, and briefly we were threatening was going to have to stand in for Alva if Alva no you were there on time, Alva. It was a purely behind the scenes moment. That's now, they always say don't look behind the scenes, but here you are. And thanks a million to Paul, who is doing the technical stuff as well. And I'm sure there's other people doing technical stuff that I don't even know about. But thanks a lot to you all for making this happen. And thanks a lot, everybody, for coming and attending and posing all your really great questions. And hope to see you all at meetings and protests and demos and rallies and everything else pretty soon. So thanks a lot, everybody.